Hey everyone, Chris Dutton here from Maven Analytics, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through a beginner-level Excel project to build an interactive coffee shop sales dashboard from scratch. We're going to load up the data, do some basic QA and profiling, apply some formulas and functions, and finally use pivot tables and pivot charts to bring that data to life and design our own interactive dashboard. Now, this project is part of our brand new guided project library, where you can build and apply and sharpen your skills by solving real business problems. You can work through these totally independently, you can view hints, or you can watch our expert-led solution videos to see how data professionals would solve these projects step by step. So with that, let's dig into our assignment details for our coffee shop sales dashboard. This is a really fun one, and it's great for beginners who are just getting their hands dirty working with data. So here is the situation. You've recently become a franchise owner at Maven Roasters, a coffee shop chain with 3 locations around New York City. Now, to better understand purchase behavior and help streamline operations, you've collected transactional data from the first half of 2023. And your goal here is to transform that data into an interactive, dynamic dashboard that you and other franchise owners can use to identify patterns, trends, and opportunities for the business. So we're going to break things down into 3 core objectives. Objective 1 is all about profiling and preparing that raw data for analysis. Objective 2 is about exploring the data using Excel pivot tables. And finally, Objective 3 is about bringing that data to life and designing and building a dynamic dashboard to visualize patterns and trends in the data, and ideally come up with some interesting recommendations for the Maven Roasters business. Now, if you'd like to follow along with me, you can either create a free account at mavenanalytics.io to access our guided projects, or you can head to our free data playground, search for the coffee shop sales data, and click download to access the same spreadsheet that I'll be working through in this project. Now, for the rest of the video, what I'm going to do is introduce each of the 3 core objectives for the project, along with each associated task, and then follow it up with my solution walkthrough videos. Now, I would strongly encourage you to pause the video and work through those objectives and tasks on your own first, since that really is the best way to learn and apply your skills. But if you get stuck, feel free to watch my solution videos to see how I would tackle those objectives. Good luck. All right, so let's get started with Objective 1, preparing the data for analysis. So for this objective, you've got 4 separate tasks to address. We're going to start by getting familiar, doing some high-level data profiling, and then we're going to add some calculated columns. We're going to add a revenue field based on the price and quantity, and then we're going to do some date and time parts to pull out things like the month, the day of the week, and the hour of the day from our transaction date and transaction time columns. So without further ado, let's jump into Excel and give this a shot. Okay, so if you'd like to follow along, go ahead and open up a new Excel workbook and load up the coffee shop sales dataset. This is what it looks like, and remember that first task is really just to get familiar with this dataset. We want to understand things like how many transactions we're dealing with, what's our date range, what products are sold at this bakery. So one way that I love to do this is by just simply selecting that header row and adding some filters. I'm going to use the Alt-A-T key tip, and that's going to drop filters on each of these column headers. So quick pass through, you can see we've got a transaction ID field, looks like a sequential indicator that uniquely identifies each of our transactions in the data set. If I control arrow down to the bottom of our list, you can see we're dealing with just under 150,000 transactions total. And let me just page or tab through the headers and see what we've got. So we've got the transaction date captured in column B, an actual timestamp here in column C, got the quantities in column D, and then here in columns E and F, we've got information about stores. So there's a store ID that maps to a store location, and based on our brief, we know that we've got 3 different Maven Roasters locations: Astoria, Hell's Kitchen, and Lower Manhattan. We also have several product-specific columns here. We've got a product ID in column G that maps to the unit price, the product category, type, and product detail. Now, typically, if you're dealing with data stored in databases or data models, this product level detail and the store level detail would likely be held in different tables, where you'd have to use tools like SQL or Power Query to tie them together. In this case, we've got it all in one place, so it's going to be nice and easy to work with. So a couple things I might be asking myself, as I'm first exploring this data, what's our transaction date range here? Looks like we've got data from January through June 2023, first half of the year. Got timestamps that seem to start around 6 a.m. Again, we've got 3 different store locations represented here. We can drill into our unit prices and start to get a sense of the range. Looks like we have prices as cheap as 80 cents for a product, all the way up to $45. If we wanted to understand that a bit more, we could just do some simple sorting here. Looks like the 80-cent product is a flavor shot, which makes sense. And if we sort largest to smallest, that $45 product looks like a premium coffee bean, which also makes sense. So let's go ahead and sort this back on transaction ID to get us back into our original order. And we can drill in to start to understand some of the product information here as well. So it looks like Maven Roasters sells bakery items, branded items, which might be apparel or merchandise, coffee, coffee beans, drinking chocolate, flavors, loose tea, packaged chocolate, and tea. So pretty standard fare for a coffee shop. And if we wanted to kind of scroll through, we could start to understand at a deeper, more granular level what types of specific products and what details are associated with those products. But at first glance, this is all making a ton of sense. I don't see any obvious glaring QA issues like missing data, outliers, miscategorized text, things like that. So that's good enough for me. Let's move on to task 2, adding a new column to calculate revenue. Now, a little pro tip here, one thing I like to do is instead of inserting columns here inside of my raw data, I like to kind of add or append them over on the right side. And that just helps me distinguish between my raw, untouched data and these fields that I'm adding or calculating or engineering. So let's go ahead and add a revenue header here in column L. And it's really just as simple as the transaction quantity in D2 times the unit price in column H. That's going to give us our revenue. Double click to shoot that formula all the way down. And then let's right click that whole column, format those cells as currency with 2 decimal places. That looks great. That task is complete. Next up, let's add some new columns to extract month and day of week from this transaction date here in column B. We'll start by extracting them as values, and then as a bonus, I'm going to show you how you can display them as actual text. So I'm going to add a few headers here. Let's kind of page over. Month, then month name, and weekday name. Whoops, weekday has 2 E's. There we go. So the easy approach here, starting with month, is to use, you guessed it, the month function, and just point it right there at the date field, B2. When I do that, it's going to give me a 1, which is associated with January, and same goes with February as a 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 to get us through June. So that's kind of like a month index or value, which makes sense. I'm going to skip column N for now and go to weekday, where we're going to use Excel's weekday function, point it to B2. And the only difference here is that this one has one additional argument, which basically lets you customize how you want to map those values to the days of the week. Personally, I like this second option, which assigns a 1 to Monday and a 7 through Sunday, but feel free to use whichever one you'd like. So let's close off that parenthesis, press enter. We get a 7 because January 1st, 2023 was a Sunday. So that looks good. And now here's the little pro tip bonus for you. These numbers aren't entirely intuitive. So what if we wanted to actually show these months and weekdays as text? Well, we can use Excel's text function. We can point to the date field, and then in quotes, we can specify how we want the text to be formatted. So for month, what I'm going to do is 3 M's. That's the code for the short month. And when I close that off and press enter, you can see that instead of a 1, I get a JAN for January. If I actually change that to 4 M's, I get the full month name instead. I prefer the short month, but again, go ahead and choose whichever option you'd prefer. And then very similar approach here for weekday. We're going to use that text function, point to B2, and this time we're going to format it using DDD, which is the short day name. That's going to give me SUN or sun for Sunday. So that's task 3 complete. Now we're on to task 4, which is extracting the hour from our transaction time field. And this one's pretty simple. Excel has a pretty intuitive function called hour. We can point it right here to C2 this time. That's our transaction timestamp. Close it off, and that's going to give us a number which indicates the hour of day that that transaction was made. So a couple final steps here. One thing that I like to do is just kind of format these headers a little bit to indicate that these are calculated fields. Not required at all, but if you'd like to follow along, feel free to do the same. That way there's a clear differentiation between that raw data and these calculated fields. And last thing I want to do here is just clear these filters. Alt-AT. Let's add them back. Alt-AT. Now they're going to include these new ones. And we can do a quick spot check. So we can look at the revenue figures, which seem to make sense at the transaction level. We should see month index values from 1 to 6. We do. We should see January through June. Looks good. Weekdays from 1 to 7. Weekday names, including all 7 days. And the hours that this bakery or coffee shop made sales. Looks like from 6 a.m. to 20, which is 8 p.m. So it all checks out. That looks good. And that officially wraps up our first objective for this project. Okay, welcome to Objective 2, exploring the data with pivot tables. Now in this video, I'm going to walk through solutions to each of these 4 tasks. Again, if you haven't attempted these on your own yet, I'd highly encourage you to pause the video and do that. But our goal here is really just to start slicing and dicing that data to expose some interesting patterns and trends. We'll start with a pivot table to show total revenue trended out by month, and then drill deeper into when these transactions tend to occur by both day of week and hour of day. From there, we'll dig a little bit deeper into our product data, and we'll show the number of transactions by product category, as well as transactions and revenue by product type, filtered down to just the top 15 products. So let's go ahead and shift gears into Excel and start working through these tasks. All right, so for those of you following along, you should see an Excel workbook that looks something like this. We've got those calculated columns that we added here in columns L through Q as part of objective number 1. And now we're shifting into pivot table mode. So all we need to do is select any cell in this range. Going to head to Insert, Pivot Table, drop it into a new worksheet and press OK. Go ahead and rename that sheet. Something like Dashboard. This is where we're going to be building that final report. And remember, task 1 was to insert a new pivot table on a new tab, like we've done, to show revenue by month. So here in our field list, let's go ahead and find that revenue field. Those are the values that we're analyzing. And in this case, we do want to aggregate that revenue as a sum, which makes sense. And we want to break down those revenue values by month. So we can either use the original month column, which is numerical, or in this case, I'm going to use month name just because it's a bit more readable and a bit more intuitive. And there you have it. We've got sum of revenue broken down by month, January through June. We can right click to format those cells as currency with no decimals. And there you have it. Task 1 is complete. Now task 2 asks us to add 2 more pivot tables on this same sheet to show transactions broken down by day of week and by hour of day. Now I don't need to go back to our raw data sheet. What I can actually do is select this existing pivot table, Control C to copy it, and Control V to paste it down here. This gives me a second independently controlled pivot table that I can work with without modifying the first. So now we don't care about revenue anymore. We can pull revenue out. We want to understand the number of transactions. And to do that, remember that each row, each record of our data set represented a transaction, and our transaction ID uniquely represented each row. That means that if we pull transaction ID into values, we don't want to sum them up, right? These aren't fields that get aggregated. It's just a numerical index to identify each row. But if we do a count instead, using our value field settings, I'm going to change sum to count. That's going to tell us the count of transactions, the count of rows or records in the data set that fall into each of these row labels or categories. And remember, we no longer want month name now we want by day of week. So let's grab our weekday name field, pull that one into rows, and now we see the count of transactions on each day, Sunday through Saturday. And if you want to change this to have it start on Monday, you can grab the edge of that box and drag Sunday down to the bottom and reorder it custom like that. So very similar approach for the hour of day breakdown. Let's copy this pivot, create another one right beneath it. We still want the count of transaction ID, but this time instead of weekday name, we want that hour field that we created, like so. And that's going to tell us how many transactions occurred at each hour of the day, in this case from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. So that's task 2. Next up, we're going to start to look at some product-specific trends. We're going to add another pivot table on the same sheet. I'm going to copy and paste. And this time we want to show the number of transactions by product category, and we want to sort these descending by transactions. So again, we're good for values. Instead of hour here, let's go ahead and grab the product category field, pull it into rows. And now I can select this little drop down next to our row labels. I'm going to use more sort options, descending by the count of transaction ID. And when we do this, we see coffee at the top of the list with just over 58,000 transactions, followed by tea, bakery, drinking chocolate, etc. So that's task 3. We're on a roll. On to our 4th and final task of this objective, which is to add another pivot table showing the number of transactions and revenue by product type. So let's go ahead and select all, copy paste one more time. And now instead of just transaction ID as values, we're going to go ahead and grab revenue as well. And again, we do want the sum of revenue here. It does make sense to aggregate those revenue figures. And instead of product category, we want to go one level deeper to product type, like so. Now the only other thing I need to do here is sort these descending by the number of transactions, right here in my more sort options, descending by count of transaction ID. And I want to apply a top N filter to only show the top 15 product types by transactions. So to do that, I can drill into my value filters options, select top 10, bump up to 15, and we're showing the top 15 items by count of transaction ID. Press OK, and that looks good. So there you have it. That's objective 2. We've created these 5 new pivot tables to begin breaking down our raw data in interesting ways. Next up, in our 3rd and final objective, we're actually going to bring this data to life and use pivot charts to visualize these trends. Welcome to our 3rd and final project objective, building a dynamic dashboard. Now, up to this point, we've done some basic data profiling, we've done some exploratory analysis with pivot tables. Now it's time to visualize this information. So in this solution video, I'm going to walk through each of our 5 tasks. We're going to start by adding pivot charts to show our revenue and transaction trends using chart types like lines, columns, and bars. Next, we'll assemble those charts into a rough dashboard layout. Now, you can design your own layout or you can follow my lead. That's totally up to you. From there, we're going to add something called a slicer for store location. That's going to allow our end users to actually filter all of this information for different Maven roasters locations. Last but not least, we're going to adjust formatting, alignment, and polish to take this dashboard to the finish line. Now, once we've done that, we're going to take a big step back, think about the business context and the project brief, and start to spot some interesting patterns and trends, and more importantly, to inform recommendations that might help to improve the business. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters here. So with that, let's jump back into Excel and build ourselves a dashboard. All right, so here we are in the Coffee Shop Sales Excel workbook. I'm in the Dashboard tab, and here you see those 5 pivot tables that we created in Objective 2. So to kick off Objective 3, the first thing we need to do is add some basic pivot charts here. And we'll start with revenue by month. To add a line chart, we're going to head to Pivot Table Analyze, Pivot Chart. And because this is time series data, we're looking at trending over time, and we have a date field, in this case month, as our x-axis, a line chart is the most appropriate visual to use here. So let's go ahead and press OK. That'll drop it into the worksheet. And I'm not worried about style or polish or format or anything quite yet. I just want to get these basic charts here in the worksheet. So let's close our field list just to give ourselves a bit more room and keep moving on. So let's do day of week and hour of day. These are both going to be column charts. So pivot table analyze, pivot chart, clustered column, that looks fine. Same thing for hour of the day, analyze, pivot chart, column. And already you can see how these visuals are starting to create these patterns that otherwise would be very hard to see just looking at the raw data. Now, last pivot chart we want to add is for product category. We're going to use a bar chart here. So pivot chart, bar. Again, it looks a little bit funky, but we're going to fix all this in just a bit. And that should do it. We have our 4 pivot charts, 1 line, 2 columns, and a bar chart. And that's task 1 complete. Now, task 2 is to start assembling these charts into a rough dashboard layout. And we want to create some space for this bottom pivot table, the top 15 products with transactions and revenue, because we'll actually just use that pivot table itself as opposed to creating a chart or graph on top of it. So one thing I want to do here is just change these column widths to give myself a little bit more design flexibility. I'm going to be snapping these objects to the grid. So this is a little bit of a pro tip here. If we change column width to something like 3, or let's go with 4, that's going to give me a little bit more flexibility again to kind of align these objects how I see fit. Now, as I'm thinking about, dashboard design and layout, I'm going to hold the Alt key. That's going to snap the object to the underlying grid. That's going to help me with alignment, but I'm starting to think about, what do I want my end users to understand? How do I want them to consume the information in this dashboard? How should the information flow? What types of reading patterns should I be thinking about to maximize the effectiveness of these visuals? So first things first, I'd like to include this kind of high-level revenue trending chart right here at the top of the view. It's the quickest snapshot to show kind of business health and revenue trending over time. And then beneath that, then I'm going to kind of nest these more detailed day of week and hour of day charts, because these are a little bit more kind of nuanced and a little bit more granular, right? So this gives me a really nice flow. I'm looking at monthly level information at the top, and then as I move down to the left, I see day of week level information, and then all the way down to hour of day. That feels like a nice, logical, intuitive flow. And then beneath these two kind of time series charts, now I'm going to get into my product detail. So this is where I can drop that product category view right here. And again, just working on some alignment to start roughing these into place. That's looking pretty good. And I'm going to leave a space right here for that top 15 pivot table. And to do that, what I can do is actually select all of the cells in that pivot. And in the Analyze menu, I have a Move option where I can select a new location on the worksheet, which in this case will be right here. And we'll press OK. Obviously, we're going to need to adjust some of our column widths here. This is a little bit of art and science, but that's looking pretty good. We can just kind of resize that one back down. Same with our line chart. And I'm pretty happy with this general layout and reading pattern. So let's call task 2 complete. Now, task 3 is about adding a slicer for store location. Now, a slicer is basically just a visual filter, and it's going to give users a tool that they can use to filter all of the data in this dashboard. So to insert it, I need to select some value in a pivot table to start. Let's use our revenue trending pivot here. We're going to head to Analyze, Insert Slicer, and select that store location field like so. And now check this out. As I select different store locations, you'll notice the data in the first pivot and the line chart here, which is tied to that pivot, those values change, but nothing else on the sheet changes. But that's an easy fix. We can just head to our slicer menu, report connections, and this is going to list all of the other pivot tables on our sheet. And don't worry about the pivot table names. We could customize these if we wanted to, but what matters is that you select each of these 5 checkboxes and press OK. Now when we make different selections to our slicer, all of our data, including our pivot tables and pivot charts, updates accordingly. So that's task 3, and now we technically have all of the components that we need for our working dashboard. At this stage, you can take this in any direction you choose. You could do all of your own styling and formatting, or you can follow me step by step to see how I would polish a report like this. Now, one thing I like to do right off the bat, anytime I'm building a dashboard that's user-facing or client-facing, is I like to hide the raw data itself so that it's not a distraction. In this case, I can hide columns A through B. And I like to hide the grid lines, which you can see I've already done here. That's in the View menu right here in the Show options. So you can hide grid lines, you can hide formula bars, and what this does is it makes it feel more like a report canvas and less like a spreadsheet. So at this point, I'm kind of just going to go object by object, applying kind of my own visual style, but feel free to follow along if you'd like. I'm going to start by updating this slicer here. And if I right click to the slicer settings, one thing I want to do is change this default name, which pulls in the raw data header name. And I'm going to update the display header to something like select location so that users know that this is a filter that they can adjust to update this dashboard. And if you don't love the vertical style here, you can also head to the slicer menu and change the number of columns like so. You can make it a horizontal style. In this case, let's keep it vertical and kind of squeeze it right in here. Again, I'm using that Alt little tip to align things. And I'm going to kind of move this one over and squeeze it right into this space. Obviously not a perfect science here, but that's looking pretty good. Let's just change the slicer style a bit to a more neutral gray, and I'm happy with that. Now let's go through each of our pivot charts and apply some similar styles. First thing I do with almost every pivot chart in the Analyze menu is I hide the field buttons. We're not going to be controlling these through the charts. We don't need them. They're just kind of noise. So let's go ahead and hide all of them. And we can just do this for each of our charts at the same time, like so. And now starting with our line chart, we don't need our legend here. That's redundant. We really don't need our grid lines. That's kind of just noise. We can make the same changes to our column charts as well. Again, this is kind of up to you if you'd like to follow along or make your own decisions here. But I like that kind of clean and minimal look without extra redundant ink on the page. And I don't really love the default blue, so let's format that data series. And I'm going to use that nice dark navy blue here, still kind of a neutral color, but I like this one a little bit better. I'm going to make the line size 2, and why don't we add some markers and data labels here as well. So I'm going to add some built-in markers like so, using that same dark blue color and no border. And we can right-click, add data labels, and if we format those data labels, we can put them above our markers or data points, make them bold. Let's use that same blue font. This is nice and readable. Last thing I want to do here is add a nice descriptive title, something like total revenue by month. And one little pro tip here, if there are certain words in the title that you really want to draw the user's attention to, in this case, maybe total revenue, what you can do is use color and a bold font style to really draw attention to those certain words. So that's a really nice clean line chart. Very happy with that. Basically going to take a very similar approach to the rest of our charts down below. So let's start with our column chart here. Format the data series. We're going to use that same dark blue throughout. And one thing I like to do is drop the gap width down to about 100. Just seems to help with readability here. And again, a nice title, something like transactions by day of week. And this time what I really want the user to understand is that we're looking at day of week level information. So I'm going to use that bold and font color effect like so. And I'm going to take a very similar approach to our second column chart with our hour of day trend. So same dark blue, same gap width of 100, and same descriptive title, except this time it's transactions by hour of day. Bold, blue, looking good. Now, similar story here with our bar chart. Format the series, change the color, update the gap width. This should be looking pretty familiar at this point. There's one extra step here with the default bar charts, which is that your x-axis will appear at the bottom, which means your largest series value will show up at the bottom of your list, in this case, coffee. And I actually want this to be at the top of the list because it feels much more intuitive to read from the top down. So to make that change, you can right-click the y-axis, format that axis, and check this box that says Categories in Reverse Order. That flips it over, so now we see coffee, tea, bakery at the top of the list, which looks great, but we have this weird floating x-axis. So the way I like to address this one is to add data labels here, right at the end of our bars. Make them bold, give them that same blue, and now the axis itself is redundant, and we can delete it and update our chart title. This one's transactions by product category, and I'll bold product category, which takes us to our final kind of visual here, which is our pivot. So let's start with our headers. We're going to call this top 15 products so that it's very clear there's a top N filter applied. We'll update this one to just transactions, and this column we'll call revenue. And if you get a warning like this, here's a little tip. All you need to do is add a space at the end, and Excel will accept that. So that's looking pretty good. We don't really need the grand total down here, so let's go to Analyze, or actually Design, grand totals off for rows and columns. You can resize those columns back out a little bit. Let's change the number formats a bit, like so. So this is transactions. Let's make that a number with a separator and no decimals. One little tip here, you notice that the column keeps kind of changing as I'm making updates, which gets a little bit annoying, especially when you want this kind of pixel perfect layout here. You can change that setting. It's in Pivot Table Analyze, Options, and all you need to do is uncheck this box that says Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. And once you do that, that's just going to lock in the columns as you've kind of sized them yourself. So now when we make changes, it's not going to jump around on me like that. So last thing here is to format this revenue as a currency with no decimals. That looks good. And let's just match the formatting a little bit more to the rest of the dash. Let's do a dark blue fill and a white font here. And that is looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and test our slicers again. Looks good. Astoria, Hell's Kitchen, Lower Manhattan, everything's updating. And check this out, right out of the gate, you can start to see some pretty interesting patterns. And this takes us to our fifth and final task. Remember that what matters most is the business insight, and more importantly, the recommendations or data-driven decisions that are made as a result. So playing the role of this franchise owner, you can start to see some really interesting patterns by day of week and by hour of day. Here in Lower Manhattan, we see a huge spike, which seems to be during the morning commute, that 7 to 10 a.m. hour, major spike in sales on Monday. And then towards the evening, that 7, 8 p.m. mark, we're really not selling much product at all. So an interesting insight here may be that, we're losing money by keeping the store open past 6 o'clock. Maybe we can improve margins by changing our operating hours. We start to see some interesting product level trends. So here in Manhattan, the espresso seems to be very popular. Coffee and tea are the top products. Let's kind of compare that against Astoria, for instance. Here, the chai tea is actually the most important product or the most sold product. Again, coffee and tea at the top of the list. We don't quite see that same heavy traffic on Monday. There's a pattern there, but not quite as extreme as Manhattan. And it looks like this location stays open till 7 and transactions stay pretty stable throughout the day, all the way down to closing time. So that's kind of a very quick and dirty analysis, but it starts to give you a sense of some of these insights that you can derive from a simple exploratory dashboard like this, and some of the business decisions that you might be able to make as a result. You can impact things like product mix, inventory, pricing, operational hours, and so on and so forth. So with that, we've officially wrapped up our coffee shop sales dashboard guided project. Congratulations on making it all the way through, and I hope you learned a thing or two along the way. Now, if you enjoyed this one, keep in mind that you can access all of our guided projects at mavenanalytics.io. Projects range from basic to advanced and feature tools like Excel, SQL, Power BI, Python, and more. You can also build personalized learning plans, assess your skills, earn credentials, and browse our entire library of self-paced analytics and data science courses as well. So I hope you had fun with this project, and I'll see you in the next one.